Racist judge charges black man, then discovers he's a federal prosecutor. Malcolm Carter had spent his career upholding the law, ensuring justice was not just a concept but a reality. As a federal prosecutor, he had prosecuted human traffickers, corporate fraudsters, and corrupt officials, each case reinforcing his belief that the legal system, though flawed, was capable of fairness. But that belief was about to be tested in a way he hadn't expected. The morning had been a whirlwind. He had spent the early hours dealing with an urgent motion in a federal human trafficking case, then rushed to municipal court to handle a personal matter, a wrongful property tax assessment on the home his grandmother had left him. It was supposed to be a straightforward hearing, a mere formality to correct an administrative error. But the moment Malcolm stepped into Judge Henry Calloway's courtroom, he felt a shift in the air. It was subtle at first, just a lingering glance from the judge, a flicker of disapproval in his sharp blue eyes. Then came the moment of impact. "You're late, Mr. Carter," Calloway said, his voice laced with authority. Malcolm barely had time to explain before the judge's gavel struck. $750 fine for contempt. The words hit like a punch. Stunned, Malcolm watched as others who had arrived late, including a middle-aged white attorney and a casually dressed woman, were ignored entirely. He had been in courtrooms across the country, but never had his mere presence provoked such an immediate, disproportionate punishment. The weight of it was palpable. A hush spread through the room as if everyone understood what had just happened, but refused to acknowledge it. Malcolm took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew this was bigger than a fine. It was an unspoken declaration. "You are not welcome here." He had seen discrimination in many forms, but rarely had it been so blatant, so confidently executed. He could fight it, argue, push back, but experience told him that at this moment, resistance would be used against him. Instead, he held his composure, nodded once, and began to take notes. His mind shifted into analytical mode. What he had just experienced wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. Calloway had ruled his courtroom for years, his reputation solidified as an unyielding force. But Malcolm had already spotted the cracks in that facade. The way Calloway wielded power wasn't about fairness, it was about control, about reinforcing an unspoken hierarchy. This fine wasn't about tardiness, it was about sending a message. A message Malcolm refused to ignore. As he took his seat, he noticed a young black man in the front row, his fingers gripping the bench tightly, his jaw clenched. An older black woman, dressed conservatively, whispered to her attorney, shaking her head. Malcolm wasn't the only one who saw what had just happened. It was then that the realization struck him. This was bigger than him. He had spent his career fighting injustice in high-profile cases. Yet right here in this modest courtroom, systemic bias operated in its purest form, unchecked and unchallenged. It wasn't a question of law, but of power dynamics embedded so deeply that people had learned to accept them. Not this time. Malcolm knew what he had to do. He opened a blank page in his legal pad and with quiet determination wrote the first words of what would become a case far greater than he had imagined. Judicial misconduct, pattern of disparate treatment. The fine would be paid, but the fight was just beginning. Malcolm Carter was not new to confrontations in the courtroom. He had stood across from hardened criminals, ruthless defense attorneys, and uncooperative witnesses. But today was different. Today, the battle was not about legal statutes or the finer points of the law. It was about something more insidious. As he stood before Judge Henry Calloway, Malcolm knew that this moment, though personal, carried weight beyond his own circumstances. His $750 fine for being late wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a symptom of a deeper issue, one he could no longer ignore. The judge's demeanor told him everything he needed to know. Calloway sat high above the courtroom, his expression unreadable, but his authority absolute. Malcolm had studied men like him before, men who believed that power was their birthright, that their decisions were beyond scrutiny. They cloaked their biases in judicial formalities, wielding the law not as a tool for justice, but as a weapon for control. This was not just about a late arrival. It was about reinforcing a silent but ever-present hierarchy. And Malcolm was about to disrupt it. As he stepped to the podium, the judge's piercing blue eyes locked onto him. "You're here for your tax appeal, Mr. Carter?" Calloway's tone was dismissive, as though the fine had settled any matter between them. Malcolm met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, Your Honor, but first, I'd like to request clarification on court procedures." A slight murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge frowned. "This is not the time for procedural debates, Mr. Carter." "I understand, Your Honor," Malcolm said, his voice measured but firm. "However, I couldn't help but notice that multiple individuals arrived late to this courtroom today, none of whom were penalized. I would like to understand the criteria used to determine who receives fines for tardiness and who does not." The courtroom, already tense, seemed to draw a collective breath. Judge Calloway's jaw tightened. "Are you questioning this court's discretion?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply asking for consistency in the enforcement of its rules." The judge's fingers drummed against his bench. The weight of Malcolm's words had landed, and Calloway knew it. For the first time that morning, the judge seemed aware of the many eyes watching him, not just those in the gallery, but the clerks, the attorneys, even the bailiff who had seen far too much over the years but said nothing. The young black man Malcolm had noticed earlier leaned forward slightly, his attention rapt. The older woman near the front exchanged a glance with her attorney. They saw it too. They had lived it. The judge exhaled through his nose, the sound barely audible. "Mr. Carter, you're here to discuss your property tax case. If you have concerns about court procedures, you may file a formal complaint." "I intend to, Your Honor," Malcolm said, his voice unwavering, "and I intend to ensure this court is held to the same standard of fairness it demands from others." Calloway's face darkened. He could feel his control slipping, and men like him did not like to lose control. "Your tax case," he said sharply, redirecting the discussion. "Present your argument." Malcolm nodded, shifting gears. He opened his folder and displayed the meticulously documented property records. "Your Honor, this house has been in my family for decades. The tax assessment had remained consistent for years, yet this sudden increase of 30% has no justifiable basis. I have records from the city's own tax office proving the error." He handed the documents to the clerk, who hesitated a moment before stepping forward. Calloway barely glanced at them before making a show of flipping through the pages. He leaned back in his chair, then shrugged. "We'll review it." His indifference was infuriating. Malcolm knew what was happening. This judge, a man who had just arbitrarily fined him for an offense he had ignored in others, was now attempting to dismiss his actual case with the same unchecked power. But Malcolm also knew something the judge didn't. He was no ordinary petitioner. He was a federal prosecutor, and he had just witnessed enough to take action. With deliberate calm, Malcolm collected his papers and returned to his seat. The hearing continued, but he no longer paid attention. His focus was now on a larger issue, one that stretched beyond this courtroom. Judge Calloway had made a mistake. He had assumed Malcolm was just another powerless individual walking into his courtroom. But Malcolm was not powerless, and he was about to make sure this courtroom would never be the same again. As Malcolm Carter sat in the back of the courtroom, his mind was already forming the next steps. He had seen enough. The law was meant to be impartial, yet here, in this very courtroom, it was being wielded selectively. The unspoken rules of this place had been exposed. A courtroom where the severity of punishment depended less on the violation and more on who was standing before the bench. But Malcolm wasn't just a man fighting a property tax error anymore. He was a federal prosecutor, and he had just witnessed a judge wielding authority in a way that reeked of bias. And now? Now he was going to make sure Judge Henry Calloway answered for it. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at his office earlier than usual. The U.S. Attorney's emblem glistened on the wall behind his desk as he set down his briefcase. He pulled out his notebook, the one filled with notes from the prior day's hearing. As he flipped through his scribbled observations, his focus sharpened. Every detail mattered. He noted the judge's demeanor, the dismissive tone when speaking to him, the discrepancy in how other latecomers had been treated. His legal mind dissected every second of the exchange. This was not just personal. This was systemic. A sharp knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Julia Monroe, his assistant U.S. attorney, stepped inside, a stack of files in her arms. "Morning, Malcolm," she greeted, her brow furrowed. "You're in early." "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "I witnessed something yesterday that I can't let go." She set the files down, intrigued. "What happened?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, tapping his pen against the desk. "Judge Henry Calloway, Greenville Municipal Court. He fined me $750 for being late. The thing is," he paused, collecting his thoughts, "there were other people who arrived after me. White defendants. No fines, no reprimands, just me." Julia's expression hardened. "You think it was deliberate?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "I know it was. And I know this wasn't an isolated incident." Julia crossed her arms. "So what's your next move?" Malcolm reached into his bag, pulling out a folder filled with printouts from public case records. "I spent last night digging into Calloway's history," he said. 5 years of municipal court data. He's been doing this for a long time. Black defendants, fined at significantly higher rates. White defendants, fewer fines, more warnings, and even dismissed cases. The patterns are impossible to ignore. Julia let out a slow whistle. "You're not just looking at a bad judge," she murmured. "You're looking at a case of systemic racial bias." Malcolm nodded. "And I plan to make sure the Department of Justice looks at it too." He turned to his computer and began drafting a report. The first paragraph was simple but damning. "On September 14, 2023, I, Assistant U.S. Attorney Malcolm Carter, personally witnessed conduct in the Greenville Municipal Courtroom that raises significant concerns regarding judicial impartiality and racial bias. The presiding judge, Henry Calloway, demonstrated clear disparities in his treatment of defendants based on race." He wasn't just filing a complaint, he was building a case. For years, Malcolm had prosecuted corruption, corporate fraud, and even organized crime. But this was different. This was about the integrity of the very system that was supposed to uphold justice. If a courtroom, a place meant to be the great equalizer, was instead being used to reinforce inequality, then the system was failing. And Malcolm Carter wasn't about to let that stand. The air in the municipal courtroom was thick with tension as Malcolm Carter took measured steps toward the podium. This was his moment, not just to defend himself, but to hold the very institution of justice accountable. The room was packed, with attorneys, court clerks, and a few spectators watching with a mix of anticipation and unease. Judge Henry Calloway sat high on his bench, his usual aura of authority wrapped around him like an impenetrable shield. But today, that shield was about to crack. "Mr. Carter," Judge Calloway said, his voice steady but edged with irritation. "If you're here to continue arguing about your fine, I suggest you reconsider." Malcolm didn't blink. Instead, he pulled a folder from his briefcase and set it down on the podium with deliberate care. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "I'm not here about my fine. I'm here about something much larger." The room, which had been humming with whispered conversations moments ago, fell silent. Judge Calloway's fingers twitched slightly against the armrest of his chair, betraying his discomfort. Malcolm could tell. The judge knew. He knew what was coming. Malcolm flipped open the folder, revealing pages upon pages of case records, complaints, and statistical analysis. "This," he continued, "is a record of your courtroom decisions over the last 5 years. It details a pattern of disproportionate fines, harsher sentences, and dismissals that appear to be dictated not by law, but by race." Judge Calloway's face darkened. "I will not stand for baseless accusations in my courtroom." "Neither will I," Malcolm countered, his voice calm but firm. "Which is why I've taken the liberty of forwarding this data to the Judicial Review Commission. And as of this morning, an official federal inquiry into racial bias in your courtroom has been opened." A murmur swept through the room. The court clerks exchanged uneasy glances, and even the bailiff, a man who had stood beside Judge Calloway for years, shifted his weight uncomfortably. Everyone could feel it. This was a turning point. Calloway gripped the gavel as though it could somehow restore his slipping control. "I suggest you tread carefully, Mr. Carter. You're dangerously close to contempt of court." Malcolm stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "And you, Your Honor, are dangerously close to being removed from the bench." The judge opened his mouth, but no words came out, because the truth was staring him in the face, and for once, it refused to be ignored. The weight of the moment hadn't settled before Malcolm Carter stepped out of the courtroom and into the cool morning air. His heart was steady, but his mind was racing. The confrontation with Judge Calloway was only the beginning. Now came the part he excelled at, the investigation. By the time Malcolm reached his office at the U.S. Attorney's Office, his assistant, Jordan Wells, was already waiting for him, files in hand. "You really did it, didn't you?" Jordan asked, raising an eyebrow. "The courthouse is buzzing." Malcolm loosened his tie and took the files, flipping through the first few pages. "That was just step one," he said. "Now, we prove it." The evidence was overwhelming. Years' worth of disparate sentencing, unjust fines, and courtroom bias filled the pages. The numbers didn't lie. Black and Latino defendants were penalized at disproportionately higher rates than their white counterparts for the same offenses. Malcolm had seen systemic bias before, but this was blatant, calculated discrimination, hiding behind the authority of the bench. "We need more," Malcolm said, scanning the files. "Witness statements, former defendants, court staff willing to talk." Jordan nodded. "I already reached out to some public defenders who've seen Calloway's courtroom firsthand, and you'll want to see this." He slid a handwritten notebook across the desk. Malcolm flipped it open. Meticulous notes, dates, case numbers, descriptions of how Calloway handled different defendants. He skimmed through an entry from last year. Black defendant, unpaid parking tickets, fined full amount plus late fees, no explanation allowed. White defendant, same charge, given a warning. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Who wrote this? Clerk named Margaret Tate. She's been working there for over a decade. Says she's been keeping these notes in secret because she knew something was wrong. Malcolm exhaled. This was the kind of corroborating evidence that made cases airtight. "I want to talk to her, see if she's willing to testify." Jordan hesitated. "She's scared, says Calloway has friends in high places." "Then we make sure she knows she's not alone," Malcolm said, "and that justice is finally catching up to him." As Malcolm looked down at the growing pile of evidence on his desk, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about Calloway anymore. This was about every judge who thought their power made them untouchable. It was about an entire system that had let corruption go unchecked for too long. And Malcolm Carter had just lit the match that was about to set it all on fire. Judge Calloway had spent decades ruling from the bench with unchecked power, but now, for the first time, he felt trapped. The walls of his own courtroom, the same ones that had granted him authority and deference for years, were starting to feel like a cage. The morning had started like any other. He presided over a series of minor cases, hiding his growing anxiety behind the gavel. But something was different. The murmurs in the courtroom, the hesitant glances from the clerks, and the reporters sitting in the back row told him that the storm had arrived. And then he saw him, Malcolm Carter. The federal prosecutor sat near the back, arms crossed, watching. Judge Calloway had spent his career convincing himself that he was untouchable, that his courtroom was his kingdom and his word was final. But now, as he scanned the room and saw the quiet defiance in the eyes of court staff, he realized he had made a grave miscalculation. The investigation had moved quickly. The Judicial Review Commission had subpoenaed years of sentencing records, exposing a clear pattern of racial bias. Margaret Tate, the longtime clerk, had come forward with her notes, and the testimonies of former defendants and public defenders had painted an unmistakable picture of systemic discrimination. Behind closed doors, whispers turned into open discussions among the courthouse staff. Even his allies, other judges, city officials, had begun distancing themselves, unwilling to be dragged down with him. The state's Judicial Ethics Board was now involved, and the media had seized on the story. Still, Calloway wasn't ready to fold. He believed that power could be held with intimidation. But when he walked into his chambers later that day, he found a sealed envelope on his desk. Inside was an official letter. A hearing had been scheduled before the state's Judicial Oversight Committee. A public hearing. His fate would be decided in front of the very people he had ruled over for years. As he stared at the letter, the weight of what was happening finally settled in. Malcolm Carter had done what no one else had dared. He had looked him in the eye and called him out for what he was. A man who had mistaken his robe for absolute power. And now, that power was slipping through his fingers. The hearing room was packed. The air was thick with anticipation as Malcolm Carter took his seat near the front, his face calm but unreadable. Across from him, Judge Calloway sat stiffly, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair. The once feared judge, a man who had ruled with unchecked authority for decades, now looked like a relic of a crumbling system. Cameras flashed as reporters scribbled furiously, eager to document what would undoubtedly become a historic moment. The Judicial Oversight Committee sat at the front, their expressions ranging from stern to expectant. The lead investigator cleared her throat, then leaned forward. "Judge Calloway, after reviewing your case records from the last decade, we found a significant pattern of racial and socioeconomic bias in your courtroom. Do you deny these findings?" A hush fell over the room. Calloway clenched his jaw. His instinct was to deny, to deflect, to wield the same arrogance that had shielded him for years. But he could feel the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his career, he had nowhere to run. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, now wavered slightly. "I have always ruled according to the law," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Malcolm's gaze remained steady. He had spent months uncovering the layers of injustice that had been allowed to fester in Calloway's courtroom. The unfair sentencing, the unequal fines, the dismissive treatment of Black and Latino defendants while wealthier white offenders were given leniency. Today, all of it was laid bare. The lead investigator adjusted her glasses, then delivered the final blow. "Judge Calloway, given the overwhelming evidence, this committee is recommending your immediate suspension pending a full judicial review. Do you have anything further to say?" Calloway opened his mouth but found no defense. The power he had wielded for so long had vanished. Malcolm exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about Calloway. It was about changing the system that allowed men like him to thrive. As he stood to leave, a young Black law student caught his eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of what this moment meant. The reckoning had begun, and Malcolm Carter had made sure that this time, justice wouldn't be ignored.